Thanks for downloading the McKay interview. My newest guest is Debora MacKenzie. She's been covering emerging diseases for more than 30 years across a range of well-known journals and titles, including The New Scientist. And we talk about emerging viruses, pandemics, and COVID-19. How COVID-19 started, current developments, and what the future looks like. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm returning to the big story of the past 2 years, namely COVID-19 and the 2020 pandemic. Life, at least in Switzerland and neighboring countries, is slowly returning in many, though not all areas of life, to something resembling pre-COVID times. Those who've suffered tragic family loss due to the virus are not going to forget the past 2 years. But human nature being what it is, there is a chance that now that the situation is better, and now that a vaccine, or rather vaccines, have been invented and distributed and injected into arms of most, but still not all of us, we might become forgetful and, heaven forbid, complacent. The point of this radio interview is to examine the topic closely with help of someone who has been investigating, questioning, researching, writing, publishing, and speaking about pandemics, including but not only COVID-19, and to alert us to why we must not be complacent and what we personally can and must do. My guest is Debora MacKenzie, and she's been covering emerging diseases for more than 30 years across a range of well-known journals and titles, including The New Scientist. And by the way, she's been reporting on COVID-19 from the very start. I've read one of her books entitled COVID-19, The Pandemic That Never Should Have Happened, and How to Stop the Next One. It's brilliant, rather unsettling, but I recommend it to you. And now she has an updated and expanded edition out now called Stopping the Next Pandemic, How COVID-19 Can Help Us Save Humanity. She's just finished addressing the British-Swiss Chamber of Commerce in Geneva via Zoom, and I'm grabbing a few extra minutes with her because I'm very keen to know more about how things stand regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, what her research and journalistic inquiries have uncovered about what has happened over the past couple of years, and what the immediate future holds for all of us. And I'm sure that you, dear listeners, are interested in that too. Hello, Deb. Welcome to the McKay interview. It's good to see you again, even though it's only on the Zoom screen.
Yeah, sorry about that. As you know, ironically, I actually contracted COVID myself, and that's why I cannot do this in person.
You couldn't make it up, Deb. There's got to be a situation comedy in that kind of story. You could write the book as well.
The book of how I got COVID and still do radio.
No. Anyway, exactly. Deb, I know that you're one of the first journalists to suggest that COVID-19 could become a pandemic, and I'm sure you'll tell us as our conversation progresses how your opinion was received at the time. But here's my first question. Though the news of the progress of the COVID-19 pandemic is not on our TV screens as much as it was this time last year, it is still newsworthy. Give me a quick overview, continent by continent, of where we are now.
Well, in fact, the continents are remarkably consistent in where they are with COVID. Every one on the WHO dashboard, with all the case numbers, has just had a huge spike of COVID cases entirely because of the new super contagious Omicron variants. Countries everywhere have had some of their highest case numbers ever. The peaks have now gone down, but the virus is still changing. And it's hard to believe people are claiming this pandemic is over.
Yeah, it's amazing. So tell me, or just for the benefit of many of our listeners, how did it start? What have we learned about Wuhan, the labs, and the behavior of those with operational control? And has media attention and even a large section of public opinion been unfair to Wuhan and been unfair to China?
There has been more disinformation on this than any other single aspect of the pandemic, I think. People are desperate to point fingers of blame. I don't think they've really thought through what that can possibly achieve, really. I can tell you a few things based on what the scientists know. The virus that causes COVID was not made in a lab. It really wasn't. Everything about it is normal for a bat virus. It's how it got from the bat to people. And there's a lot of ways it might have happened. I mean, we can't rule out that it infected somebody working in a lab with bats themselves. and then got into humans from that person. There's no evidence for that. It's very tempting to think that it was no coincidence there was a bat research lab in Wuhan and COVID started there, but it might be precisely that, a coincidence. It's one of the main sort of thinking kind of mistakes they warn you about. Just because something is very appealing doesn't mean it's true. There are also bats living in the countryside around Wuhan that carry related viruses. That's where Zheng Lixi, the scientist who runs the main Wuhan viral lab, actually discovered them. There's a widespread traditional eye medicine used across China, made from dried droppings from those same bats. And the droppings from those bats have viruses in them. The important thing to recognize here is not who did what, point fingers, assign blame. The important thing is to recognize that there are dangerous viruses out there, and we have to be much more careful, including with bats and with bat research.
Talk a little bit about strategies to deal with it. And as I raised China, and as you've given a good account of why maybe we have been a bit unfair to China, what is your opinion of China's 100% lockdown strategy to contain the virus? Has it worked? Will it work? And in the same vein, what of New Zealand's strategy? A similar strategy, though in a thriving parliamentary democracy, unlike China.
Well, China did an amazing job of containing COVID after it finally recognized what was happening in January of 2020. But it's important to note that it only locked down people in Wuhan and a couple of neighboring cities. All other cities in China were not locked down. People seem to think everybody was. No, that's not true. People in some places were put under stay-at-home orders, like the ones they used here in France during the first lockdown. They could leave home to shop and stuff. Transport within and between cities was shut down. There was a lot of testing and isolation facilities that were made available. Contact tracing was used to limit spread, and basically China contained the epidemic by March, which is an astonishing achievement, really, considering they almost let it get out of control. Now it's hoping to do that again, but the virus is very different now. For one thing, it's much more contagious, and it spreads too fast for contact tracing to work. I think China is going to have to learn different methods for handling the pandemic, and like everyone else, we'll end up having to live with COVID. The same thing's happening in New Zealand. I mean, being an island helped. Having a very enlightened government helped. They did the right thing at the very beginning. They stopped virus from getting in. They tested, they locked down, they stopped cases from spreading when they found them. They did a brilliant job. As a result, both China and New Zealand did not have the economic damage and the deaths that people who didn't take those measures took. But now New Zealand is facing the same problem as China. They haven't had much in the way of cases. And, fortunately, New Zealand is very heavily vaccinated. So they're going to have to sort of slowly open up. They're going to have to live with the virus. It's going to come in. It's probably going to kill some people because the vaccine, like all vaccines, is not 100%. That's going to be hard in populations that have gotten used to thinking, oh, we're safe, but you can't stay cut off from the world forever. Hong Kong is finding the same thing, but because of different attitudes to government there, they shut down. They kept themselves from having a lot of cases. As a region of China, that was easy because they had all the good things China did. But now they're opening up again and people aren't vaccinated. And therefore, they've had huge spikes and a lot of mortality, especially in older age groups, because those have been the people refusing vaccination. So everybody's going to have to handle this according to their local circumstances, as has been the case throughout the pandemic.
So it's an adaptation of John Kenneth Galbraith's "When the Facts Changed, I Changed My Mind, Young Man. What did you do?"
Yeah,
and also understanding human behavior.
Mm.
Yeah,
that's not just Galbraith. That's any scientist you could name.
Yeah, no, that's true. Let's go to the other end of the continuum now, to the science and pharmaceutical research. Medical scientists and pharmaceutical researchers at large pharma companies developed a vaccine in ultra quick time. At least it seemed to me and to many other members of what I call the general public. With all your years of experience, Deb, following this subject, did that surprise you? This rapidity, the speed?
There are actually three parts to the answer, if I may.
Okay. Yeah,
the first part sums up as more of a relief than a surprise. The second part is not surprised at all. And the third part is also not surprised at all. The first part was that they could make a vaccine at all. There are a lot of people were worried about this in the scientific community. There is a well-known coronavirus malady of cats, which is they've been trying to find a vaccine for years, and they just haven't been able to. Some viruses of cats, yeah, I think it's feline infectious leukemia. I'm not sure if I got that right, but it's a very widespread coronavirus, and the veterinary industry would love to have a vaccine, and they've had several experimental ones, and it seems to just make the disease worse. I mean, the immune system of cats and humans is a very complicated thing, and messing with it doesn't always give you the result you're expecting. I mean, that's virtually the definition. In fact, that is the definition of a complex system. And people were worried that it was going to be like that. And it turned out that a simple vaccine, just using the surface protein from the virus, worked brilliantly. That was an enormous relief. Now, that said, the fact that they could develop and test it, those are two different things, in record time was not a surprise at all. There's a really good book called Vaxxers by the two women who led the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine at Oxford University. And they describe what it's like normally to develop a vaccine. You do your animal experiments, you write the paper, it comes out in the journal a few months later, and then you write another grant and you'd say, we'd like to take this on, it's very promising, and then maybe you get your grant and you do the experiment, and then you write the paper, and it takes a few months. It's all stop and start, you know, it takes forever. The thing is, this time we knew we needed this vaccine. So they didn't have to go through all that.
That's the puzzle, because I thought it normally took about 10 years to take a new drug from test to market. But
that's why it takes 10 years in the case of vaccines. For one thing, typically they're not high priority because they're not high profit. You know, you sell a vaccine product maybe once or twice to a person, 3 times maybe. Okay, I've had one 4 times, but you know, still, it's not like a new painkiller, you know, or a new hair loss cure or something. I mean, you know, it doesn't make you a lot of money. So people, it's not high priority. It takes a long time to just for a small biotech startup, or as the women at Oxford were, an academic lab, to sort of slowly develop a vaccine. We pulled all the stops out on this. The important thing is that we didn't stop any of the experimental or testing work. We just stopped the stuff in between. You've got to write a grant proposal every time you make another step to get permission and money to do the next step. They just kept going. They developed the techniques for making the vaccine in parallel with the techniques for developing the vaccine, so they didn't have to stop and do that at the end. That was much quicker, but that was not because they sacrificed substance. It's because they sacrificed admin, which is normally very onerous. That book by those people called Vaxxers, which I recommend, is the best description of that I've seen. The most important thing, and I would like to, if I may, insist on telling you this part, is that people say that, you know, it can't possibly be safe because it took them no time to test its safety. That was because there was so much COVID about. People don't, this hasn't been explained enough. Basically, what you do when you test a vaccine is you vaccinate a few thousand people, either with the real vaccine or with the vaccine that's got everything in it but the active ingredient. So it's kind of a placebo. It isn't expected to have an effect. But you duplicate everything in your control group and your test group except the presence of the active ingredient in the vaccine. And then you sit back and you wait to see who gets sick. And then you look to see whether the people who got the real vaccine were protected. That's how you do it. Now, if you were doing this for HIV, you'd have to wait 10 or 20 years till enough people got HIV to see whether the people...
The lack of volume of people in...
Yes, in COVID, there was so much of it about at that time, you know, late 2020, early 2021, that basically it took a few weeks before they had enough people who'd caught it to look at the data and say, oh, look, the people who caught it were almost entirely in the placebo group. You know, very few people who got the active vaccine got it, and they knew immediately. The thing is, that's what made it so fast. The fact that this was a pandemic.
An important factor to bring to public attention.
They weren't cutting corners.
My guest today is Debora MacKenzie, acclaimed science writer on COVID-19 and pandemics, and we're talking via Zoom about the past 2 years and what is to come. Deb, you study this subject closely. That's why we're talking to each other today. What is your view on the so-called Swedish approach compared to other Western, very well-developed countries? In the end, is it possible that all these countries will end up more or less with the same result regarding the percentage of deaths with or because of COVID-19 and the virus is spread throughout society? And that the big dividing issue has been the closing down of whole economies and the concomitant impact on people's lives. What do you say to that?
Well, we haven't all ended up with the same thing, have we? The Swedish approach, the sort of laissez-faire approach, led to far more deaths than in comparable countries like Finland and Denmark. Something like 10 times more deaths. The point of the early lockdowns and social distancing was to keep people alive until there was a vaccine. Then there was a vaccine and it was relaxed, and the people that would have died if they hadn't locked down were then vaccinated. Even Sweden admitted it was wrong to pretend that somehow politeness and personal responsibility substitute for everyone making a sacrifice to limit the spread of the virus. But unfortunately, that's what you've got to do. A communicable disease is profoundly a communal experience. It has to be controlled by everyone working together. Some people psychologically, there's actually research on this, are afraid to think about the fact that they have to work for the common good because they fear that somehow they'll be disadvantaged. But you just can't do it any other way. The idea that it was somehow a choice, to address your last point about shutdowns and the effect on the economy, the idea that there was somehow a choice between the economy and lives was shown early on to be a false choice. South Korea, for example, took stringent precautions early on, ended up with both a much healthier economy and fewer deaths. You can't have a healthy economy where a lot of people are dying.
No, that's true. After all your reading and research, I'm not of mask wearing. Can you hear me? Mask wearing, social distancing, and hand washing.
Yeah, the hand washing we've known for years limits respiratory diseases. They got that with flu. That's an old one. Washing your hands is just a good thing when it comes to limiting respiratory diseases.
Mask wearing, people,
yeah, yeah, it does. Mask wearing, if you've got a decent mask. Now that's
the key. It depends on the type of mask.
It does. When I was in London last week, I was wearing what is some places called an N95, and here is called an FFP3. And I guess I didn't wear it consistently enough because I managed to catch COVID. They're not 100%, but they're better than nothing. And I think we've seen that there is clear data that in places where there were masks, they had a lot less cases in the community than in places where there weren't. The thing is, it got confused early on because people didn't realize quickly enough, the WHO didn't take account early enough of the fact that this thing spreads before you have symptoms. And they thought, okay, look, masks were invented to protect patients from doctors. Doctors wear masks so they won't cough their germs into the open wounds that they're working on, basically. They're not designed for that. So they thought, well, you walk down the street, you're using up masks that the healthcare people need, and it's not going to protect you really because ordinary medical masks aren't made for that. And anyway, if you've got this, you're going to be homesick. So, there's not going to be anybody out in the street walking around exhaling virus. It's not going to do any good and it's going to be a waste. So they said, don't wear masks. And then they discovered, oh, actually, you will be out in the street walking around and spreading virus if you've got this. In fact, people are at their most contagious. They shed the most virus a day or two before they develop symptoms. So then they found out, oh, right, actually, maybe you should wear masks now. And, everybody went, oh, there, you see, the scientists don't know what they're doing. They changed their minds. Yeah, they changed their minds because, as you said a minute ago, you change your mind when the facts change. And that's exactly what happened with that. The thing is, though, that now that they've told everybody, for example, in London, you don't have to wear a mask anymore. Pandemic's over. No, it's not. And, everybody, I was on the tube. There's still signs up saying, wear a mask, please. Very good of them to do that. But very few people were. And, and I caught it because I was wearing, as good a mask as I could get. And it probably helped. It has helped up until now. But yeah, still got it.
I'm sitting here. Can you hear me? Sorry.
I can now. Yeah. When you move that way, I can't hear you anymore.
I see. Okay. I'm sitting in Geneva. We must address the performance of the World Health Organization. The pandemic was the most serious in 100 years. We know this. The WHO was in the heat of the fire and took criticism from some quarters about its slowness in the beginning to act and even being in the pocket of China. What's your view on the WHO's performance?
Well, some people seem to be very angry that the WHO wasn't more publicly rude to China in the early days. I wonder what they imagine that would have achieved. There's nothing to stop China from simply saying, sorry, I'm going home, and refusing to cooperate with any other country or the WHO, and that would have been a disaster. The WHO needed to keep talking to China about the virus in order to deal with the pandemic, and so it needed to rely on diplomacy. If it had more power, maybe it could have brought more pressure to bear. China was far too secretive early on, but the member states themselves have seen to it that UN agencies do not have enough power to ever constrain the action of member states.
Yeah.
Then some member states complain when the agency doesn't reprimand or change the action of other member states. I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. If this pandemic has shown us anything, it is that we all need to work together on things like this, and we need to establish an international norm that you don't keep dangerous outbreaks secret. One of the ways of establishing that might be to give the WHO more power to investigate when something like this happens, to send in inspectors, for example, like they do with chemical weapons and a few other things that are controlled by treaties. But I'm not sure how the WHO publicly berating China would have achieved that. Pointing fingers to get blame might satisfy some people. But what was important then for the WHO was to find out what was going on, and to keep China on side. And they were walking a very delicate diplomatic tightrope. I think they did very well.
Two last questions, two bigger questions before we conclude. Looking outside of our own neighborhood, so to speak, how will we address getting the populations vaccinated across Africa, Southern Asia, and Latin America?
More money for vaccines. The WHO set up a good plan to ensure everyone got vaccinated, and basically the rich countries just grabbed what they could, and everyone else had to wait. And this is frankly shooting ourselves in the foot. The virus continues to circulate unchecked in countries, mostly in Africa, where there's been very little vaccination, and every case is a chance for COVID to evolve in ways we might not like. It might become more deadly. It might evade our immunity. It's astonishingly short-sighted of rich countries not to make absolutely sure that poor countries are vaccinated as well. We all need to limit cases as fast as we can to slow the evolution of the virus, because it doesn't care where it is, it evolves.
Last question, a pretty obvious question, really, because you've written books about it. What's to come?
More pandemics. There are an estimated 10,000 viruses in the world that can infect humans and haven't yet. Most of them live in livestock.
Say that number again, please. Say that number again.
There are about 10,000 viruses.
10,000, yeah.
It's been estimated.
Yeah.
Out there in animals that can make themselves to home in humans, like COVID. It's a bad virus. Basically, they're mostly in livestock. In wildlife. They're also in livestock. And we need to watch out for them a whole lot more. The trouble is we're just destroying biodiversity. We're cutting down rainforests. People who they're poor, they need a farm, they move into these places. And they're living cheek by jowl with bats, which, never saw a human until this happened. And when you destroy the biodiversity, you destroy the habitat, the wildlife is stressed, they're sicker, they pass on viruses more, and basically viruses are jumping to humans from wild animals more often as a result. It's been estimated that if we just spent what, in comparison to military budgets, is a pittance on protecting rainforests, on controlling germs on farms, on watching the wild animal trade, and limiting human exposure to some of these viruses, we would save millions of lives and billions of dollars by halving the chance that we will get a pandemic virus from animals jumping to us. And we have to do that as a matter of urgency. You don't often hear people saying we've got to protect the rainforest to stop the next pandemic, but we do. I mean, you also have to invest in new vaccines and drugs, and they're doing that, and that is very good. We need that as well, because some of these viruses will get through, and we have to be more ready for them than we were this time. For one thing, we have to have some better pandemic plans in place. But we also have to stop pushing the natural world, because it pushes back, and it pushes back with things like COVID or worse. We have to remember that COVID was actually a pretty mild pandemic, a 1% death rate. It was easy to make a vaccine in the end. I mean, not easy, but pretty straightforward. It needn't be like that. The next one could have a much higher death rate, and it could be much harder to control.
Deb, thanks. Straight from the shoulder, as usual. Wonderful. It's been great talking to you, invaluable insights. And I wish you a speedy recovery from your your COVID infection. My guest today has been Debora MacKenzie, the well-known science writer and journalist, especially on COVID-19 and pandemics. Thank you again, Deb.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Please share the show with those around you. And if you have any questions or feedback, write to me at contact@mackays.ch. I promise that I will reply to you.